And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska aviation weather outlook on this Thursday, September 26, 2024. And this outlook will be for Friday into Saturday. Now, we're going to start out on Friday morning. There's an area of low pressure coming up across Haida Gwaii into British Columbia that will bring an area of rain brushing the southern panhandle. But the main weather emphasis coming up here the next couple of days, we're going to have a few weak low pressure centers that are just going to kind of pivot around each other, and eventually secondary low development will take place down here just south of Kodiak Island by the time we get into Friday. And this is where we'll find most of the MVFR and IFR conditions. These lows are not especially strong. They're rather weak compared to some of the low pressures we've seen impact the Gulf and areas of the west and southwest coast over the past 2 and 4 weeks. But starting out here Friday morning, there'll be some IFR conditions along central western Alaska range, especially in the highest ridge lines and up through the peaks. Widespread IFR conditions southeast Bering Sea up into the Alaska Peninsula along the Kuskokwim, Bristol Bay coastline. And then an area of snow and lower ceilings out over the lower Chukchi Sea that may come on inland here around Point Hope up toward, say, Point Lay, and extending down through the Bering Strait on over toward the north side of St. Lawrence Island. For Friday afternoon, we find that those IFR areas persist here through the lower Chukchi Sea, down through the Bering Strait and just east of St. Lawrence. Also, maybe not quite the extent along the coast, but in the southeast Bering and then back up into parts of the Alaska Peninsula and even the east side of Kodiak Island. Areas of the interior will see VFR conditions with some pockets of MVFR. But weak high pressure up here for the next couple of days should keep the weather rather benign. And even down into the panhandle after that initial low works up into British Columbia, things should be improving to VFR with maybe MVFR conditions along the intercoastal mountains. Saturday morning, we find IFR conditions up there toward Dead Horse to Kaktovik along the Arctic coast. Just some lower ceilings, lower cloud cover there. Also up here, again, along the area around Point Hope to Point Lay, and then down along the southwest coast, because this is just kind of an area where these few low pressure systems are going to be pivoting from, and eventually some of that energy will develop a secondary low here just southwest of the Gulf. By the time we get into Friday afternoon, though, with that secondary low development, there will be some IFR conditions along the east side of Kodiak Island, the western Gulf, also back up toward Lake Iliamna into the southwest interior, and again along areas of the west coast from the Bering Strait all the way down the YK deltas, including St. Lawrence and Nunavik Island. But again, Saturday afternoon, weak high pressure should bring generally VFR conditions across much of the interior. So pass conditions on Friday, Anaktuvik Pass, we're looking for MVFR becoming VFR. Adigan Pass generally should see VFR conditions during the day Friday. As we drop down toward the Alaska range, MVFR conditions, Lake Clark and Merrill becoming VFR. And Rainy Pass could see that area of IFR conditions becoming MVFR as we go through, especially past midday Saturday. Takes a little longer this time of year to improve conditions just because of the lower sun angle, and it's more difficult to mix out the lower atmosphere. Windy Pass, MVFR conditions becoming VFR. And as we head east, Isabel Pass also starting MVFR, becoming VFR. And Mentasta Pass, we'll see some MVFR conditions in the morning, becoming VFR by afternoon. Tanita Pass off to the north, VFR conditions should prevail, but MVFR conditions becoming VFR. And areas of the Copper River Basin could once again see some patchy fog in the morning hours that could at least reduce those categories, even locally IFR, MVFR in some locations. Portage Pass, MVFR becoming VFR, and then finally in the northern panhandle, Chilkoot and White should generally see VFR conditions on Friday. Now, freezing levels at the surface do kind of come on down into areas of the western and northern interior. Obviously, there will be pockets where there's some clearing where you will have temperatures at or below freezing come Friday morning. Certainly all around the Alaska range into the St. Elias Wrangell Mountains. We find freezing levels aloft below 2,000 feet all the way across much of the mainland, with the exception along Bristol Bay and then coming on up through Cook Inlet and along the northern Gulf Coast. No really strong systems, a couple areas of low pressure that are back out here. We have maybe freezing levels bumping upwards aloft to 6,000 feet south of the Alaska Peninsula, but nothing like what we see when we have a really strong low with a strong frontal system. So Friday, the best chance for some moderate icing will be the southern parts of the Panhandle, especially in the morning, above 6,000 feet. And then as due to an area of rain that's going to be coming up through and heading northeastward into the Canadian interior. Back to the north and west, there's a pocket of snow out over the lower Chukchi. So within those clouds, the western Brooks Range above 2,000 feet, there could be some moderate icing. And then also that a couple areas of low pressure that are sitting here in the southeast bearing off of the Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bay coast. We could see some moderate icing above 4,000 feet. And looking at the winds aloft, 30,000 feet, the jet stream level, broad troughiness, generally speaking, in this region. We do find light winds over much of the interior. We have a couple of jet cores. The most notable is coming in off the North Pacific into British Columbia with 145 knot jet max there at 30,000 feet. And then back here toward the western central bearing, the flow is generally north-northwesterly with winds in excess of 100 knots south of the central eastern Aleutians. Now bringing it down to 9,000 feet or roughly 700 millibars, again we find some stronger winds over western into central Canada, 35 upwards of 60 knots as you get into central Canada. Here is a hint in the mid-levels of the low circulations we have here over the southeast bearing. Still some south-southwest flow along the west-southwest coast, upwards of 30 to 40 knots. Across the Aleutian chain, winds are generally northerly, 30 to 40 knots, and then a pocket of stronger winds back here out into the western bearing off the Kamchatka coastline at 50 knots. And at 3,000 feet, we have the low circulations closer to the surface. There's generally a belt of winds 35 to 45 knots circulating around this broader circulation. Lighter winds across the mainland and into the northern central panhandle. And if we take a look at where the greatest threat for some turbulence will be, it's on the backside of the low circulation here back through the central Aleutians. You may find some moderate turbulence, mainly surface, to 3,000 feet.